teen gang member who spent 31 years behind bars. On a cold night in Chicago in 1992, two men were gunned down in what police would later describe as a gang-related execution. The shooter was not a hardened adult criminal. She was only 17 years old. Her name was Jacqueline Martinez. Within days, detectives launched an intensive investigation that would uncover a story of gang violence, abuse, revenge, and murder. What began as a street conflict would eventually send a teenage girl to prison for more than 3 decades. But this was not an ordinary murder case. According to court records and later statements, Jacqueline grew up surrounded by violence. She claimed that her stepfather was deeply involved in gang activity and exposed her to a world most children never see. Instead of toys and childhood memories, she grew up around guns, drugs, and criminal activity. As the years passed, she became involved with street gangs operating in Chicago. By her teenage years, violence had become a normal part of daily life. Then everything changed. One of Jacqueline's closest friends was murdered. The killing sent shockwaves through her circle. Police reports and witness statements suggested the murder was connected to ongoing gang disputes that had been escalating for months. For Jacqueline, the loss became personal. She believed she knew who was responsible. And according to investigators, she decided to take matters into her own hands. What happened next would alter the course of her life forever. Authorities say Jacqueline tracked down 2 men connected to the conflict. Armed and determined, she confronted them. Moments later, gunfire erupted. When the shooting stopped, both men were dead. The murders immediately triggered a massive police investigation. Detectives interviewed witnesses, collected evidence, and began piecing together the events leading up to the killings. As pressure mounted, investigators focused their attention on Jacqueline and her associates. Eventually, arrests were made. The case quickly attracted attention because of one shocking detail. The alleged shooter was still a teenager. Despite her age, prosecutors treated the case with the same seriousness as any adult double homicide. When the trial began, courtroom observers described Jacqueline as defiant and unemotional. The evidence presented by prosecutors painted a picture of deliberate revenge. The defense argued that years of abuse, gang influence, and trauma had shaped her decisions. But for the victims' families, none of those explanations changed the outcome. 2 men were dead, and someone had to answer for it. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached its verdict: guilty. The sentence that followed would change Jacqueline's life forever. Life in prison. At just 17 years old, she was led away in handcuffs and transported to a maximum security prison. Most teenagers worry about school, friends, and their future. Jacqueline's future would now unfold behind prison walls. She had no idea that she would spend the next 31 years there, and prison would prove to be every bit as dangerous as the streets she left behind. In 1992, after being sentenced to life in prison, 17-year-old Jacqueline Martinez was transferred to Dwight Correctional Center, a maximum security prison for women in Illinois. The moment the prison gates closed behind her, the reality of her situation began to sink in. For years, she had projected an image of strength. She was involved in gangs. She had survived violence on the streets, and she had just been convicted of a double murder. But prison was different. According to Jacqueline, the fear she felt on her first day was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The teenager who once acted fearless suddenly found herself surrounded by women serving decades-long sentences for murder, drug trafficking, armed robbery, and other serious crimes. Many had spent years adapting to prison life. She had spent only a few hours. The prison population was filled with inmates who understood one thing better than anyone else: weakness could be exploited, and Jacqueline knew it. As she entered the facility, she expected hostility from everyone around her. Instead, some older inmates approached her. They offered clothes, a television, and advice. But their warning was unsettling. They told her to prepare herself. Prison was dangerous. People would test her. And if she failed to stand her ground, she could become a target. For Jacqueline, survival became the priority. Within days, she realized that prison had its own hierarchy, its own rules, its own power structure, and violence was often used to enforce those rules. According to her account, tensions quickly emerged between rival gang members inside the prison. Many inmates carried street conflicts with them behind bars. Old rivalries didn't disappear. They simply changed locations. One day in the prison yard, Jacqueline found herself surrounded by members of a rival gang. The confrontation became intensely personal. Among the group was a woman related to one of the men Jacqueline had been convicted of killing. The woman confronted her directly. She reminded Jacqueline of the lives that had been lost, and she warned her that prison could become her grave. For a brief moment, violence seemed inevitable, but prison staff intervened before the situation could escalate further. Still, the message was clear. Her reputation had arrived before she did, and many inmates already knew exactly who she was. Over time, Jacqueline adopted a hardened prison identity. She believed showing fear would make her vulnerable, so she projected the opposite: aggression, confidence, and a willingness to fight. According to her own description, this transformation became a survival mechanism. She convinced herself that weakness was dangerous. Every interaction became a test. Every confrontation became a potential threat, and every day carried uncertainty. Yet beneath that hardened exterior, she was still a teenager. At night, when the prison became quiet, the reality returned. She was serving a life sentence. She was far from home, and she had no idea if she would ever be free again. As weeks turned into months, prison life became increasingly violent. Fights were common. Conflicts erupted over respect, territory, relationships, and personal disputes. Improvised weapons appeared throughout the institution. Objects that seemed harmless could be transformed into dangerous tools. Toothbrushes, metal fragments, pieces of plastic. Anything could become a weapon. According to Jacqueline, many inmates learned quickly that survival often depended on how others perceived them. A single act of intimidation could prevent future attacks. A reputation for violence could become a form of protection. For Jacqueline, prison became a constant balancing act between fear and survival. Then came an incident that would further shape her reputation inside the prison. Shortly after arriving, she witnessed another inmate being attacked. According to her account, several women had cornered the victim. Believing she needed to act, Jacqueline intervened. What followed was a violent confrontation that eventually landed her in disciplinary confinement. But inside the prison, word spread quickly. The incident earned her attention, and in an environment where reputation mattered, attention could be both a blessing and a curse. As years passed, prison slowly became her reality. The outside world continued moving forward. Technology changed, cities changed, families changed, but behind prison walls, time seemed frozen. Days blended into weeks, weeks blended into years, and before long, Jacqueline faced a frightening possibility. She might spend the rest of her life there. What she didn't know was that prison itself would become another battlefield, one filled with violence, corruption, power struggles, and secrets hidden behind the walls of a maximum security institution. And some of the most dangerous challenges were still ahead. For most people, prison is punishment. For others, prison becomes an entirely different world. By the mid-1990s, Jacqueline Martinez had already spent years inside Dwight Correctional Center. The teenager who entered prison terrified and uncertain had transformed into someone completely different. Prison had taught her one lesson above all others: trust nobody. According to Jacqueline, violence was everywhere. Not necessarily every hour of every day, but always close enough to remind inmates that danger could appear without warning. Arguments could become fights. Fights could become stabbings, and small disagreements could have life-changing consequences. Inside prison, reputation often mattered more than anything else. A reputation for weakness could attract predators. A reputation for violence could discourage them. Many inmates spent years building that reputation. Others became victims because they never could. As prison life continued, Jacqueline became increasingly involved in conflicts. Years of gang culture and survival instincts followed her behind bars. According to her account, Gangs still existed inside the institution. They were different from street gangs, but their influence remained. Old rivalries continued, old alliances remained intact, and new conflicts emerged constantly. Yet gangs weren't always the biggest source of violence. Relationships often created just as much chaos. Unlike the image many people see in movies, women's prisons developed their own social structures. Relationships formed, breakups happened, jealousy grew, and sometimes those situations turned violent. According to Jacqueline, fights over romantic relationships were among the most common causes of conflict inside the prison. Arguments escalated, weapons appeared, and disciplinary reports followed. For prison administrators, maintaining order became a constant challenge. But another problem existed behind the scenes: contraband. No matter how secure a prison appeared, prohibited items somehow found their way inside. Drugs, cigarettes, unauthorized goods. According to Jacqueline, inmates often discovered ways to create underground economies. Those economies generated power, and power generated influence. Money inside prison didn't always look like money. Sometimes it was food. Sometimes it was favors. Sometimes it was protection. Everything had value. Everything could be traded. And everyone understood the system. But perhaps the most shocking allegations involved correctional staff. According to Jacqueline's account, some officers abused their authority. Others became involved in inappropriate relationships with inmates. Several investigations over the years reportedly examined misconduct allegations inside the facility. The accusations painted a troubling picture of life behind bars, a place where rules sometimes existed only on paper, and where power could easily be abused. For inmates already serving decades-long sentences, these conditions created enormous tension. The result was an environment where violence could erupt unexpectedly. One incident would have a major impact on Jacqueline's future. According to her account, she became involved in a confrontation with a correctional officer. The situation escalated dramatically. What began as a dispute turned into a violent encounter. The consequences were severe. Additional years were added to her sentence. For someone already serving life, it might seem insignificant. But inside prison, every additional year mattered, especially when hope was already in short supply. As the years passed, prison slowly changed Jacqueline. The anger that once fueled her survival began to take a toll. She watched inmates arrive. She watched inmates leave. And she watched others die behind bars. Some never made it home. Some lost contact with their families. Others lost hope completely. Meanwhile, the outside world continued moving forward. The internet became common. Cell phones became everyday devices. Entire generations grew up. Yet inside prison walls, life remained largely unchanged. Then came a turning point, a moment that Jacqueline would later describe as the event that forced her to rethink everything. It wasn't another fight. It wasn't another prison sentence. And it wasn't another gang conflict. It was a phone call, the news that her mother had died. For years, Jacqueline had convinced herself that prison was her permanent home. She believed she would die behind bars. But losing her mother shattered something inside her. For the first time in years, she began questioning the person she had become. The gang identity, the violence, the anger, the reputation she had spent decades building. Suddenly, none of it seemed important anymore. And for the first time since entering prison, Jacqueline began thinking about a future she never believed she would have. A future outside the prison walls. What she didn't realize was that changes happening in courtrooms across America would soon give her an opportunity almost nobody thought possible. A second chance. And after more than 2 decades behind bars, the legal system was about to reopen a case that many believed had been closed forever. For more than 2 decades, Jacqueline Martinez believed she would die in prison. The years continued to pass. The prison walls remained the same. The routines never changed. And every morning began with the same reality. She was serving a life sentence. At some point, Jacqueline stopped imagining freedom. She stopped thinking about release dates, because there wasn't one. According to her account, prison had become home. Not because she wanted it to be, but because it was all she knew. Then tragedy struck. The person who had remained closest to her throughout her incarceration was gone. Her mother died. For Jacqueline, the loss was devastating. Over the years, she had built a reputation inside prison. She had survived violence. She had survived isolation. She had survived decades behind bars. But she wasn't prepared for this. The death of her mother forced her to confront something she had avoided for years. Her own life, the choices she had made, the people she had hurt, and the future she believed she would never have. According to Jacqueline, this was the moment everything changed. The anger that had fueled her for years slowly began to fade. She became focused on education, personal growth, and rehabilitation. For the first time, she began trying to build something instead of simply surviving. She earned educational certificates, participated in programs, and began distancing herself from the identity that had defined much of her life. But while she was changing inside prison, something important was happening outside prison. Across the United States, courts were reconsidering how juvenile offenders were sentenced. Legal experts argued that children and teenagers should not automatically receive the same punishments as adults. Several major court decisions began reshaping sentencing laws. One of those rulings would eventually affect Jacqueline's case. Because she had been sentenced to life in prison as a juvenile. Suddenly, after decades of believing she would never leave prison, she had a chance. A chance that many inmates never receive. A resentencing hearing. Lawyers reviewed her case. Advocates supported her petition. And eventually, the legal system agreed to take another look. For Jacqueline, the possibility felt unreal. She had spent so many years preparing herself to die in prison that freedom seemed impossible to imagine. Yet the process moved forward. The court scheduled a hearing. Victims' family members attended. Supporters attended. And once again, Jacqueline found herself standing before a judge. Only this time, she wasn't the angry teenager from 1992. She was a woman who had spent more than 3 decades living with the consequences of her actions. The courtroom became emotional. Victims' relatives spoke about their loss. The pain had never disappeared. Years had passed, but the impact of the murders remained. For them, the tragedy never ended. Jacqueline also addressed the court. According to her account, she expressed remorse for the murders. She acknowledged the damage her actions had caused. And she accepted responsibility for what happened. The judge listened. The attorneys presented their arguments. And finally, a decision was reached. Jacqueline's sentence was modified. For the first time in more than 30 years, there was an end date. There was a path home. After spending nearly her entire adult life behind bars, Jacqueline was eventually released in 2022. The moment was overwhelming. Prison gates opened, and she walked into a world that had completely transformed. When she entered prison, the internet barely existed. Smartphones didn't exist. Social media didn't exist. Entire technologies had appeared while she was incarcerated. Simple things suddenly felt unfamiliar. Shopping, restaurants, cell phones. Everyday activities became new experiences. Freedom was exciting, but it was also frightening. According to Jacqueline, adjusting to life outside prison was far more difficult than she expected. For years, prison routines had controlled every aspect of her life. Now every decision belonged to her, and that freedom came with challenges. Finding housing, finding employment, building relationships, learning modern technology, starting over. Many former inmates struggled during this transition, and Jacqueline was no exception. Yet she remained determined to move forward. Instead of returning to the world that had led her to prison, she focused on helping others avoid the same path. She began speaking publicly about her experiences, sharing lessons from her life, and warning young people about the consequences of gang involvement and violent crime. Today, Jacqueline openly acknowledges her past. She does not deny the murders. She does not claim innocence. Instead, she speaks about responsibility, regret, and the possibility of change. For some people, her release remains controversial. The families of the victims continue living with their loss, and many believe the original sentence should never have changed. Others believe rehabilitation matters, and that people who commit crimes as teenagers can become different individuals decades later. The debate continues, but one fact remains undeniable. A 17-year-old girl entered prison believing she would never leave. 31 years later, she walked out. Her story is one of violence, loss, punishment, and redemption. Whether viewed as a cautionary tale, a story of rehabilitation, or a complex combination of both, it remains one of the most remarkable prison journeys in recent memory. And it all began with a decision made on a Chicago street in 1992. A decision that changed countless lives forever.